because this discourse that was engaged on Twitter was an elite discourse, it was very intense, and you could see a lot of journalists, you know, spend an unbelievable amount of time on Twitter while they were doing their reporting jobs and their writing jobs. Whether that wasn't part of how that elite discourse about the election became separated from the popular discourse or the election that ordinary people were watching. And I sort of leave with that thought, because I think,
believe it or not, voters. Tell us about that, Chantal.
Yes, the missing word in Paul's presentation until the very last line. This was my 11th federal election campaign. And I should preface this by saying that if you think I'm a Toronto Star at-issue panelist, you're missing a good section of my journalistic life, because I have a full journalistic life in French. And on that basis, I think I'm rather unique. And in this campaign, it turned out to be a huge asset on the rest of my friends. I was writing a blog full-time during the election for l'Actualité, and also carrying an almost full column both in French as well as in English. I usually go on tours, and I never got on a leader's plane in this campaign. It was an inspiration as I spent more time on the ground and actually saw the story developing, but it is not a stroke of journalistic genius that kept me off the planes. I cracked the rib in the first week of the campaign and discovered that I would write in pain for most of it, and that the most painful thing would be to carry bags on and off airplanes. So having to make a choice, I figured, well, I'm going to try to do this differently and spend the campaign on the ground, something I hadn't really done in entirety, although I'd spent most of the previous campaign on the ground in 06 and was lucky enough to hit early upon the culture cut stuff because I happened to live at the ground zero of that story, as well as in Outremont writing. So you could say geography has a lot to do with my journalism skills. Let me first say that I know what the boys on the bus syndrome was, and that I didn't find it terribly helpful, although it's always pleasant to have these back of the bus conversations with colleagues. The last thing I want to do in an election campaign is to plug into the journalistic discourse. There's a lot of that goes on when you're part of a parliamentary press gallery, be it the Queen's Park or the National Assembly or Parliament Hill. Missing from that is the distance that is needed to see what Parliament Hill actually looks like when you're not in the bubble, and in an election to see what the bubble looks like when you're on the ground. And in this campaign, I found the disconnect to be quite striking. The first week of the campaign, I was on the ground in Ontario and Quebec, and while everything that Paul talked about was happening between the journalists and the people on the planes and the tours, on the ground, only one issue seemed to resonate everywhere I went, and it was stable government, stable government, stable government. So while the general sense of people who were covering the campaign from up close was that Stephen Harper was really having a bad start and he was too message-driven, his message was resonating to the exclusion of any other message. You could hear it, you know, in the bars, and you can hear it in hotel lobbies, and you could hear it if you went to buy vegetables. It kept coming back, this, you know, maybe we need a stable government. And then the campaign moved on a bit, and I got a chance to see firsthand the distortion that comes. And I'm not against the social media. I think it's useful. It engages the engaged up to a point, but it does make the debate richer. But in a campaign, and in this campaign, some of its byproducts are really striking. If any story was driven by the social media to take on what many could argue would be extravagant proportions, it was the story of the Conservatives shutting out 2 people from a rally in Ontario.
London.
And that story was really driven by the social media. It was driven by Facebook. It originated in part from Facebook. It got really big on the Twitter cycles. And then Mr. Ignatieff, in the middle of all that excitement, media excitement, came to Brossard-la-Prairie, just outside Montreal, writing that the Liberals held at that point, but won on a recount in the last election. So a place where the writing was not only in play, but a place where the Liberals did have a shot at keeping a seat and improving their chances. And as he had over the course of the campaign, Mr. Ignatieff that evening had a very good audience. There were days in Quebec and other areas when you were lucky if you got 50 people to come for an evening in a Francophone writing, and this room was packed with people. They weren't best in from the West Island. And they were almost all of them Francophones. So Mr. Ignatieff gave a speech, and he spoke for about 75% of that speech about how the Conservatives were keeping people out of rallies and the Liberals were not. And he did it well, and those who have heard it on the campaign trail know that he was good on those issues, and it certainly resonated with the back of the room. That's where the journalists were. Those who weren't on the bus piling about what he was saying. And then he spoke for 5 minutes about how he would build single-handedly a new Pont Champlain, and that was the end of that. People applauded, and he left, and they disappeared. And since I wasn't on the bus, I stayed behind. I had to wait for my lift, so I stayed behind and waited and waited and waited, and people came out. And some people came to talk to me about the evening, and we always assume that the people who go to these rallies are basically, you know, your paid-up members that are going to vote blindly for the party. But a number of the people who came up to me said, well, you know, Mr. Ignatieff speaks well, and he looks like a nice man, but why would he spend so long not talking to us about issues? I thought, yeah, right. I mean, Mr. Ignatieff is speaking about the issue of the day for the press bus, the bubble, the Twitter world, the Facebook world, but the people who are in this room did not come here to be told they would get a bridge. Most voters don't think the future federal government will let the Champlain Bridge actually crumble in the St. Lawrence Ocean under any regime. They came to hear, and at that point there were already various surveys that showed that there was a difference between the Twitter exchanges in French and the Twitter exchanges in English, that those in French tend to deal with issues more than they dealt with politicians.
It would be nice to have some sort of accountability discussion after what happened this year and what's happened over the last few years. I'm not sure there's sufficient will among publishers and senior editors to have that kind of discussion. I'm not sure they think it's important enough. I think elections are something they get through as opposed to something that they plan for and prepare